So I scream, you scream, we all scream for Fürst Pückler. As we go into the final week of our 2666 2-month review. Jokes not landing, not worried about it at all. And what?
I'm laughing.
You're laughing.
I'm laughing on the inside for sure. Yeah.
I'm Chad Post from Open Letter Books, joined as always by Brian Wood and Katie Whittemore. How you two?
Hello.
And we are doing the last section of the last part of 2666. We've reached the conclusion. All there. So what do you think? Can you summarize 2666 in like 3 sentences?
2666, and what'd you say? 3 sentences?
3 sentences.
What would you say, Katie? You can go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just gonna say no. You're the writer. I think I want to hear it from you.
This is your elevator pitch.
In 3 sentences.
3 sentences.
You only really get 1 for an elevator pitch.
But. Okay. So you're supposed to say like someone would ask you what's the book about or something, right? And you try to tell them what the book is.
Yeah. Why are you excited about this book?
Okay.
It's an international sensation.
I think it's a love letter to literature and the gosh, because I want to talk about like violence. I want to talk about violence.
It's a detective novel.
Colonialism, the horrors of like. There's like so much to it, but in the end, it's a love letter to literature and its place in a decaying world.
Yeah.
There you go.
That's what I got. I don't know.
That's really good. It's also captivating.
Mm-hmm.
It also has captivated and astonished readers around the globe.
Oh, okay, blurb it up. A magnum opus work
and terrifying, uninspiring, irreducible beauty and despair. So almost as good as what you said, Brian.
Yeah, I think it's devastating power and complexity and a final statement worthy of a master. What I
don't even have jacket copy in my edition. It's about fucking seaweed. It's seaweed.
And algae.
Weird things.
Yeah.
Algae and seaweed. So
I loved the end of this book. I thought it was.
Me too.
It's a really cool nudge that sends it off into a different space that I thought was just masterstroke. It was so good.
Can you say some more about that? I agree. I don't know if it's for the same reasons, but I want to hear more specifics, Brian.
Well, some of just from craft wise, some of the best writing advice I ever got was about endings, that they need to be inevitable and completely and completely surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it does the 2 things at once, where it's like, of course that's how it ends, and oh my God, I didn't see it coming.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, just do those 2 things and you're good. And when you try to do it yourself, you're like, holy shit, that's really hard. Hard. And this idea of like nudging it to that scene, having ice cream and talking to this person about the historical significance of who this person is, and they're known for ice cream, was just like, oh wow, like, okay, how do I apply this to the whole book? And you're like, okay, wow, I hadn't thought about this yet, and like, yes, this is the way to land, and this is the way to end. It was.
I mean, we've talked about like many times of like writing the crimes and the importance of writing and of detailing these things, and then you get this one person's life that the one remaining real detail is that he found this ice cream.
Yeah.
Again, with enough time and enough space, you don't like you were saying the other day to me, Chad, that you only get a fact or 2 about a person, and that's all you're going to be. So.
Oh yeah, that was a dark moment. Sorry, man.
Oh no, it's fine. But
I think I bummed you the fuck out though.
No, I mean it reminds me. It's very similar to like on Things Fall Apart, where you get the whole book is about a conquo in this like wonderful like depth and dimension of this character, and then the commander guy or whatever shows up. He's like, this guy might make an interesting paragraph in my book about the histories of West Africa. Like this idea that you can live this huge life, be so important, do all these things, and ice cream, cool.
I know.
It's the whimsical nature of like fate and fame.
Mm-hmm.
And like how, I mean, it also sort of applies to Archamboldi in the sense of like, which books of his become popular and how he becomes popular feels super kind of random. Like they just keep publishing him. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, yep, everyone reads you now after not at all.
But also too, I kind of took it as, in a way, because I try to get like the line correct rather than paraphrase things, but he was on his way to Mexico. Like soon afterward, he left the park, and the next morning he was on his way to Mexico. I took that, for me, the way he has those juxtapositioned, that he realizes his life work and his legacy and everything is going to be, oh, you're the uncle of that murderer, of the serial killer.
Somewhere in
like,
here.
Everything that you've ever done your entire life is meaningless because there's a giant that's murdering women, and like that's your.
I like the line right before that. A mysterious legacy, don't you think?
Mm-hmm.
Those three lines together, mysterious legacy, don't you think? You're right, I do, said Archamboldi as he got up and took his leave of the descendants of Fürst Pückler. Soon afterwards, he left the park, and the next morning he was on his way to Mexico. One thing that reminds me of is what you're saying, Katie, and that you, Brian, alluded to the love letter, is that this section is much more sentimental and like loving.
Yeah, I mean,
familial.
Yes, I mean, in amongst like the horrors of the ravages of the 20th century and the wars, there's such tenderness. The way that certain relationships are described, or that they play out, is I really, really, really loved that. Like it was such a, but it wasn't like in like a really sentimental or maudlin way. But even like the friendship, like all the descriptions of Hugo Hadler and like their Japanese friend and like their little trio, you know, the way that like that writer, when he's still writer, like really dives into and like interiorizes Ansky, the reappearance of the Baroness, like the kind of sweetness to and like loyalty, you know. But I think between like Archamboldi and Ingborg, for one thing, like that relationship, but also the Baroness and like how they treat each other, and Bubis, like it's just like there's no other relationship portrayed in this novel like the relationships that are portrayed in the final section. Like there's goodness. He's showing goodness here.
What about, okay, I have two remarks on that. One is thinking back to the relationships between the critics. If you were to read this as a circle, that he's off to Mexico, and then you go back and read the critics part, like how this sort of would flavor the looking at their relationships and how their relationships play out. The second part is it really alters that meeting with the Baroness, that they don't not refer to the Baroness, but as the publisher's wife in the part about the critics. And like they're like, have you met him? Like, yeah, he's tall. Like, that's and right. She's like, no detail, nothing. And in that time, in the context of it, it's like, okay, cool, like whatever. And now, like, 700 and some pages later, it's like there's a really deep connection between her and
a long history.
A long history that she just like protect. And it goes back to that statement that where Bubis is talking about the first book, Ludeke? I don't know how to pronounce German at all. And then says like he has insomnia. Bubis has insomnia. First light of day, he woke his wife again and made her promise that when he was no longer head of the publishing house, his euphemism for his own death, she wouldn't abandon Archamboldi. Abandon him in what sense? Asked the Baroness, still half asleep. Bubis didn't answer for a moment. We have to protect him, he said. After a few seconds, he added, protect him to the extent possible as his publishers. And she does it like in a way earlier in the book, later on in the book, in that way too. But aside from just publishing him continuously.
What do you think about that, Chad, as a publisher? Like when she says when he says we have to protect him like to the extent possible as his publishers. In what way does a publisher protect his or
Their
her
authors.
artist? Yeah.
Well, if any of my authors are listening, you should turn this off right now and not listen anymore. No, I think there's a couple things. Like one was the dedication to him, which is like maybe not what you think of as protection from like an outside force, but an internal protection in the sense of allowing him the space to be creative and to take risks and to know that those things will be published. I think that that's important for like a creative writer of this sort. That's not like writing for a script to become like a Netflix series, but like writing this literature to be able to protect that space. And then in a way that extends into like protecting him from all the captures, all the trappings of like fame or success or people needing to know who he is. I mean, they know like when he first meets Boobus and Boobus is like, what's your real name? No one's named Benno von Archamboldi. Like, that's bullshit. Like, the von even, like, what the fuck are you talking about, buddy? Get the fuck out of here with your name. Like we've had all those references to like, well, you need to like, everyone's got, last week when we talked about like how everyone has amnesia now. And like the typewriter guy was like, well, we're all just going to have a lot of people who just don't remember where they were during World War II. And there's a bit of protection of that too, of allowing him to have this identity. It's like the Elena Ferrante situation.
Yeah, that's true.
In a way, like, it's a pseudonym. The publisher knows who the person is and is keeping that a secret so that person's life is not devoured.
I like this section on the 816, on the first paragraph on 816. Ludwig garnered 2 positive notices and 1 negative notice, and 300 copies in total were sold of the first edition. The Endless Rose, which came out 5 months later, received 1 positive review and 3 negative reviews and sold 205 copies. No other editor would have ventured to publish a 3rd book by Archamboldi, but Boobus was ready to take on not only the 3rd, but the 4th, the 5th, and every book that came along. Archamboldi was in good hands. It's like ride or die. Like
this is ride or die.
I believe in you.
Yep.
And then on the next page, on 818, 96 copies of The Leather Mask were sold, which wasn't a lot. Boobus said to himself with resignation as he went over his accounts. But the publisher's support for Archamboldi never waned.
Yep.
And even it goes even beyond that, because even when the sales are dwindling with each one, and then it goes to the point where I just don't like this book.
Yeah,
I don't want to read it.
And he gives it to the wife and the lover, and she's like, I got to page 4.
Yeah.
Like we're publishing it. Whatever.
Yep.
And they're going to give him more money. And they're going to give him more money than the last for the last one.
He is. Yeah. I made a joke about it, but like he's kind of a shitty author, man. Yeah. he's like writes books way too fast. Like they don't sell well. He demands a higher advance. Like, come on, cut your publisher a little slack.
Do we know? I didn't see, but do we know why he has this unwavering faith in? I mean, because if you think about their first interaction, like he knows he's a liar, because like he knows the name almost better, aside from the fact that it was Juarez and not
Mussolini.
Mussolini.
Yeah.
Aside from that, like he knows like this is a strange name because of this. Like he knows him better than he knows himself in some ways, and he calls bullshit, but he's okay with it. And just off of the work alone, like, is it just that he likes the work?
I think that I'm trying to find. I think it was in last week's section though, where there was like some reference to him reading it, or when he gets the letter back. What?
Well, yeah, we learned his trick. I have 2 copies, so I'll do one that's close by, and it gets rejected, and I can get it back and then send it to another one that's far away.
Okay, so I'm going to postulate 2 things. One is, so it says the day after he received the letter from Mr. Boobus, Archamboldi wrote to assure him that his novel wasn't promised to any other publisher, and that the advance Mr. Boobus had proposed was satisfactory. This is funny too, going back in time. So right before that, it says, "You're sure you're." So he gets the thing, gets the letter, and then she was like, and Ingborg was like, "Who the fuck's Benno von Archamboldi?" He's like, "Yeah, I needed, the Americans might be looking for me." And then he says, she's like, you're sure you'll be famous? Until that moment, Archambault had never thought about fame. Hitler was famous, Goering was famous, the people he loved or remembered fondly weren't famous. They just satisfied certain needs. But the closest we get is that Bubis read it and said, have you given this to anyone else? I want to publish it. Then they have their meeting. And I would say it would be whatever that, like, this is something special feeling.
Like
that you have, like, with that figure, or with that almost like the going to the Funes character. If you get something you're like, I like this, and then you see that character and be like, this is, yeah, we're in.
Well,
I've done it with people. We have people who publish forever.
Well, there's this interesting like thing about loyalty, which like that I think Bubis like represents here. And like on 806, when he's talking about like they're talking about him coming back to Germany, and like why is he going to return to Germany to start to like revive his publishing house, right? And he's talking about the network of the publishing houses and the booksellers, and how it's the only place where his publishing house is a German publishing house. That's what it is. And he's remembering, the visits with the booksellers, and he says here in the middle, and this part reminds me a little bit of a Dalkey type situation. Like he goes and he sees, the elderly owner of Bochum, who kept certain books with the Bubis logo like relics for sale, of course. Books published in 1930 or 1927 that by law, Schwarzwald law, naturally he should have burned in 1935 at the latest, but that the old bookseller had chosen to hide out of pure love, which was something that Bubis understood and few others could understand, not excluding the book's author. And so like that's really interesting. We're here introducing this idea of like pure love, where we've not had even references to love in any of the other sections, and we're ending on like the other side of the coin in a weird way.
Yeah. There are two parts of this section. You go.
Yeah, because it really is a love. It really is this really is a love letter to literature. Because I think back too with how Lottie reconnects with her long lost brother. She's like, "Who is this author? Because he must know my brother or is my brother."
Yep.
Yep.
And it's like this tender, like hurts my heart. Like they're elderly, right? So they find each other again after a life of separation. They're elderly. She's like despairing, and saying, who's going to like look after, who's going to care about my son who's rotting in Mexican prison. And this is on my 891. And Archambault, like he looks at all the books, he touched his books with the tips of his fingers. They were all different kinds of editions, hardcover, paperback, pocket size. So he's in his sister's house looking at, his own life's work. I don't know. These images are so.
There are two parts of this that reminded me of Joyce. And the love thing is one from Ulysses. There's the quote, love loves to love love. There's also a Ulysses quote, history is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake, which also feels very fitting. And then the scene where, I don't know where it is now, but where the Baroness and Archambault are looking out over the night. And that reminded me right away of like the Dead, the story from Dubliners, and the ending of the Dead with the snow falling and covering all the graveyards and all the past. But Joyce's ending of that book is so beautiful, or that story is so beautiful, that anytime that someone tries to write like a scene with people looking out kind of contemplative at like a snowfall, it automatically brings that to mind. So it doesn't even have to be a real reference. It just is kind of there.
I know, I'm trying to find that.
I am too. And what I am finding is that when he goes to look up Popescu, he searches for his life story on an American search engine. And I was like, what the fuck kind of American search engine gives you this kind of information? This is a vividly detailed life history of this man.
I know.
It's probably Ask Jeeves.
Yeah, probably is. Did you know the #1 search term on Bing is Google?
That's hysterical.
It's fair. Sounds fair.
Sure.
I also like too how this last section, I mean, it really does do a great job of kind of braiding everything together nice and tightly. Was the women's deaths in this one as well, with that crazy Verbo they stay at, where the guy, so you murdered your wife?
Like,
Yeah.
It's like, well, who told you that?
Like,
Yeah.
everyone in the village thinks you murdered her. He's like, no,
Yeah,
she died from sadness.
That description
Yeah.
was so
Yeah.
chilling. And again, like we're back to like to the ravine. I mean, it's even like
The abyss,
echoing the geography, right? But when he talks about going down, picking up her body, and all the bones are broken, and he just sort of like arranges her. He said, "Oh yeah, people thought it was a little weird, but they signed her death certificate." And
even the one that really creeped me out too was, she said, well, you threw her off a ravine. And he's like, well, which ravine? And he starts listing off the names of them, because unless you give it a name, it doesn't mean anything. And so then it means nothing. It made me think of, the bones in the desert, and just these nameless people and unmarked graves with so it doesn't, these meaningless deaths. And then the way he connected that with the story of the veteran that was talking about everywhere we dug there were bones. It was just, it's again that one like masterful way where he finds different layers of the same kind of, or like different octaves of the same note to make this creepy chord. It's really awesome.
This is really just random, but I do like the part too where Boobus is talking to the boring critic and is like, what do you think of Arcamboli's books? And he's like, he's not really German. He's like, I don't know, maybe American, maybe Latin American, maybe Asia, maybe Indonesia. It's not really like German writing. And that feels very like, that's such a good like kind of bit of like the internationalism of literature, and also Bolaño's kind of representation of like, he's kind of a European writer, but he's also very like South American and American. And like, these boundaries are so like, imaginary in ways.
Like, I wonder if you ask folks from like Chile, would they call him a Chilean writer? Or
well, there's a whole part in one of the books about that I read, one of the critical books, and there's like a lot of times where for a while they really didn't like him because he was sort of like anti-establishment to the point that it like kind of annoyed everyone. And I think that they sort of like distanced, the Chilean writers and critics distanced themselves from him. But then the next generation, that changed.
Well, it makes me think of something like I remember we were in literature, we were learning about like T.S. Eliot or Ezra Pound, and they'd say it's an American writer, and you're like, really?
Like,
well, we don't have a lot of awesome, great writers, so we'll take them.
Yeah. T.S. Eliot's so English.
Or like Ezra Pound, like, well, maybe he's from America, but he kind of was in Europe writing everything, and like this.
He was in jail in Italy,
I don't know.
American.
But this concept of like getting wrapped up of like where someone from, or like it's like this isn't the Olympics or something, like
they need to wear their jerseys.
Yeah. Although we had the World Cup of Literature before, and I want to bring it back for this year's Cup, and we pit countries against countries, books against books, and fight it out. Yeah, group stage.
What did you just real quick though? What did you think about just the off-screen death of? Yeah, just ends up in a river.
Right.
Yeah, that's so suspicious.
Shortly after the scene where the gentleman says, "Yeah, I did kill her. I wanted her to know. This isn't for you. This is for her to know."
Yeah.
That like weird kind of confessional moment.
And there's a moment somewhere around there where they talk about how she couldn't really swim anymore. Like swimming was too difficult, isn't it? I'm misremembering that. I feel like there's some reference to them, like they were somewhere like at a beach, but they couldn't go swimming because of her health or condition, and then she ends up in a river.
Where is that section about her death. Oh yeah, the next day Ingborg couldn't get out of bed. Okay, 8:32. Hold on.
8:32. Wow, I'm way off.
Because just before that, she goes missing. He wakes up,
Right.
and she's missing, and he immediately goes to, is it Lube, or I don't know how to say the guy's name, but he immediately goes to there like, hey, did you kill my wife? Or did you kill my lover? He's like, I don't know, like he didn't say that, but that's kind of the implication I got. He goes immediately to her like, hey, where is she? And he's like, I don't know, go find her, I'm freaking sleeping.
Right.
One of the week.
And then just shortly after that.
So they're drifting around Italy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, okay. Yeah, here we go. One morning, however, she received, I'm on page 836, she received a telegram from Bubis saying that Arcamboldi's wife had died in a remote village on the Adriatic coast. Without knowing why, the Baroness began to weep as if she had lost a sister, and that same day she informed her host that she was leaving Milan for the remote village, without knowing very well whether she would have to take a train or a bus or a taxi, since there was no mention of the village, blah, blah, blah. They reached a mysterious village.
And yeah.
The villagers, surly and hard at work, mending their nets and caulking their boats, told them that a German couple had in fact arrived a few days before, and shortly afterward the man had left alone because the woman had drowned. Where had the man gone? They didn't know. I mean, and from this point on, he's disappeared. This is the moment that Arcamboldi becomes a disappeared writer, right? It's right after her death. They also asked the grave digger. The German had left a little while ago, and the German woman wasn't buried in the cemetery because she had drowned and her body was never found.
I mean, that's the opening of a Netflix documentary, right?
Oh, here it is. Here we go. So on the page before 835, and when it talks about like what did they live on, probably Arcamboldi, who had learned many things working at the bar in Spenglerstrasse, turned to petty theft, robbing American tourists are easy, blah, 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 blah. And then long swims that Ingborg and Arcamboldi couldn't take, or that they postponed for another reincarnation because Ingborg's health was failing as summer came to an end, and the possibility of returning to the mountains or checking into a hospital was rejected without discussion. That's the thing I was thinking of. That then when she drowns, it's like that seems very suspicious because we just heard that she's not well enough to like take these swims that they were doing.
Yeah, I know it's like left ambiguous, but it's like, did she kill herself, or did he?
I think if anything, it was like a euthanasia, an assisted suicide type situation.
I was thinking too.
Because think about that too. Like, so it's not in a river; it's in this. They're on the Adriatic.
Yeah, you're right.
So you just can imagine them. I don't know, like them wading into the water. You know, Arcamboldi. I mean, it is a little interesting that like there's so much time spent at the beginning on his underwater adventures.
Yeah, the seaweed
and his proclivity to be, diving. That's really interesting.
Wait, that is interesting. Can I go back to like what we were talking about with the publishing side of things?
Sure.
Yes.
And Bubis. So right after, so she dies, he vanishes. Then his next book is 4 years after his disappearance, he received the weighty manuscript of Inheritance, a novel more than 500 pages long, full of crossings out and addenda and lengthy and often illegible footnotes. Favorite author ever. Just read all your illegible shit so I can figure it out. Then he says, over the course of the next few days, very cold days all over Europe, Bubis read the manuscript of Inheritance, and despite the chaos of the text, in the end he was left with a feeling of great satisfaction, because Arcamboldi had lived up to all the hopes he had placed in him. What hopes were these? Bubis didn't know or care to know. They certainly didn't involve Arcamboldi's steady output, which was something any hack could achieve, or his storytelling power, which Bubis had been convinced since The Endless Rose, or his capacity to inject new blood into the Scholastic German language, a deed accomplished in Bubis' judgment by 2 poets and 3 or 4 fiction writers, among whom he counted Arcamboldi. But it wasn't that. What then? Bubis didn't know, although he felt it, and not knowing didn't trouble him in the least, among other reasons perhaps because knowing only led to trouble. And he was a publisher, and God's ways are truly God's ways truly were mysterious.
Yeah.
I really love that. I also, it's kind of too easy, but I'm happy to die the way that Bubis died.
I know. Just
reading a book, laughing really hard at this new writer, and expiring. Working,
croaking,
laughing,
with
dying.
with a smile on the face.
Working,
But also,
laughing,
like,
dying.
it's so funny, the depiction of the publishing house, like, and the copy editor, and then the secretary, and it's like, it's very funny and very like quaint. Like, there's a lot of quaintness about this section too.
There's a series of these publishing houses throughout Europe. Anagram is a little bit younger, but there are ones that have been around in Germany from this period, or like Minuit, Gallimard from before, like the French side. There's German ones, there's Austrian ones, there's ones in every country that have this sort of status of being that kind of old, respectable, quaint sort of publishing. And on my trips on editorial trips to different countries, or specifically to the Frankfurt Book Fair, there are times where like these people all come together and they are exactly like that. Like, it's very quaint and very like this thing of like where he references like the joy of, like, he's like, nobody reads anything, but and we all complain about it and everything sucks, and this is wonderful because we're reading these books. When these people get together at like the Frankfurt dinner, I've been there a few times, and they'll like just exchange, like, here's the person that I found, here's something that I'm doing, nothing really sells, but this is really an interesting writer. And it's like the core of the publishing industry, which is beautiful and quaint and wonderful. And what's interesting is that if this were a real book, Andrew Wiley would have taken Archamboldi's rights away from Bubis and sold them to the highest bidder and fucked the whole romance of it straight away.
I do like that this comes right off of that talk about major and minor writers as well.
Yes.
Yeah, we talked last week about that part of the mediocrity too, which is so interesting.
Because but for all intents, like, until he was an extremely minor writer.
Marginal.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, and that was like Bolaño until Bolaño wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that.
And again, and I guess like that's that conversation about fate and about, there's a part, I think a lot, like this section actually is like, makes me think a lot about Javier Serena's like, rendering of a Bolaño like character in Last Words on Earth, where there's like this, there's just a real nostalgia. I've lost my train of thought. Now it's gone. Sorry, guys.
No, I know what you're saying, because it does have like the connection for me is like the sort of figure of the artist and the like perseverance of the artist, and like the way that fame just comes, and that it's sort of like neither of these are like, there's a moment where the Baroness is like, why don't we get you a big interview, an exclusive interview, and we'll launch your career. And he's like, fuck no, that's my worst nightmare. And like, in a way, like the two characters, the Funes and Arcamboldi, to me both sit in the space of like, I'm just a writer. I'm not like a marketing, that part of it. They have like the romantic figure aspect of it.
Well, and this was something that we talked about, I think, in the very first episode, which was like imagining this all today, and just how nauseating the self publicity and like has to be, or it doesn't have to be, but is, like in this age of social media. And it's like, I think it makes me sort of nostalgic for a time where people where you didn't always feel like you had to be promoting yourself. And if you weren't promoting yourself, if you weren't pitching your projects, if you weren't, what are you working on now? That there was a time where like things just either happened or they didn't for an artist or for a writer, and that you could have long periods of like toiling in anonymity, and something like miraculous could occur, or it wouldn't, and maybe it would happen 100 years later and your work is discovered, rather than this sort of like immediate sense of like, everything we do right now is important, my work is important, my book is important, and I need to just like be constantly letting everyone know that.
Really, one of my students' final papers, was about YA literature, or and trends in YA literature. But one of the ones that they pointed to as like a big starting point was John Green's book, what's the famous one, Fault in Our Stars.
Yeah.
And that there was, I forget how this all worked, but like he had other books, but there was like a special sort of like promotion that he did that really helped all of that kind of take off for him personally. But he toiled for years before he hit that. I forget what this is a dumb story. And pull the plug, abort. all done. The other section that stands out as like a set piece is the Forgotten Writers. That was for the Banished Writers of Europe, which I tried to connect with Watchmen.
Were you successful?
I don't know. I didn't get to look up the part that I couldn't remember of Watchmen. Do you remember Watchmen really closely?
Somewhat.
So there's the writers there's all the artists that are on the island, right? That are the Banished Writers. And correct me if I'm wrong, but don't they create the squid that the guy then like teleports into New York and kills all the people? So they've created that, and the goal of doing that was to unite like the East and the West, Russia and America, against the squid enemies. And so they create like this horror, like it's literal like Lovecraftian horror. And I believe that the writers are the ones that are making this horror. The writers and artists make this squid thing and from this vanished island. Is that right?
That I do not remember the actual mechanics of who built the squid and how they faked the teleporting, but I know Ozymandias was the linchpin figure behind it all, but I don't remember the little details of it.
Yes. The description of this is super long. The synopsis of there's a lot that happens. I'll try and find it, but that reminded me of that. And like just because of the word, the word of the idea of the squid being like an abyss of this horror, and like writing that and being around that and creating that, and that's sort of, this book sort of circles around that a lot. That's what made me think of it.
Yeah, I think for me now making one pass on the book, I want to go back at some point and reread the part about Amalfitano, because that's the one that I have the hardest time now completing it, connecting it to the full arc of the story. The rest of it makes total sense to me why they're there. That one strikes me as a bit mysterious. His character and his, this idea of the book and the pages and the wind, and I'd really like to go back to that one since it focuses on books, but that's for another conversation another time for sure.
It is interesting, like they do feel this. I think this for me, obviously for lots of reasons, is the section that feels most discreet, right? And separate from the others. So like let's imagine that we were like, in a literature class, and we needed to sort of think about like, what does this section do, either to tie things together or because it's almost like, it's like some things, like some, at the very, very, very end, yeah, like there's some of those loose ends come together, but like thematically, what's happening here in the last section that speaks to, well, what's all come before?
That reminds me of like we talked about this at one other point in time, is that instead of treating it as one book, each of the 5 books has a situation or a concern or a goal that kind of comes out through it. And I feel like this one is like an inheritance, more so than anything else. Like the family and the things that are passed down, and that nature of it is much stronger here and multi-generational than it is anywhere else in the book, where it's generally like singular figures or the critics. Even the Amalfitano part is like Amalfitano.
Right.
Fate is fate, and this is one that's like a little bit more sprawling, as if it's like, how do things get passed down? And is there a way to combat the horror? And that's where like this tenderness and this love, and back to the Ulysses thing, love loves to love. And like that maybe that's like the sort of non-nihilistic side of things.
Yeah, I mean, it even begins with these damaged, the mother and father, like physically damaged, coming off of war, and then him, and then how he becomes damaged from that, and then every other section is these, damaged people, damaged bodies. Where, like this, yeah, like you said, this seeds. If you have them all together, this is a bunch of backstory that gives you the seeds for all of the forest that we see later. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do like that one line from Lato when she's like, why did you give our parents like one eye and one leg? And he's like, because they only had one eye and one leg. She's like, I forget sometimes.
I don't remember this.
Like you were little. It was like you were little. You don't remember. So this is interesting. I'm curious about this section, like where with Lata. Well, actually, the other thing that's cool too, a couple of places here, like we really the narrator peeks through, like whoever the narrator is, the person, like this very last section. He says, and now, basically, and this brings us to Lot Rider, like, and now we, basically like. Everything, all this stuff has happened, and here we are. Now it's time for us to get to Lot, and I like that. I'd love to go back through at some point and trace all the little moments of the narratorial identity peeking up and like talking to us, directly in this way. There was another thing that was interesting that I marked about that, where there's like conjecture. He says. The narrator says that, what were they living on? I think someone mentioned that earlier. What were they living on? And they said, well, probably advances. And like, maybe he went to get them. Maybe he went to pick them up, or maybe the Baroness came, and it's like this conjecture. But then the next paragraph describes the meeting as if it really happened.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's like, well, why the conjecture? So that's funny too. There still continues to be a bit of play about like what, the reliability of the narrator, how much the narrator actually knows. Here it is. Sorry, page 835. Arcamboldi might have asked for another advance from the publishing house, and he might have received it by mail, or perhaps it was the Baroness von Zumpa herself who delivered it by hand, curious to meet her former servant's companion. But the meeting was in a public place, and only Arcamboldi came. He had a beer, took the money, thanked her, and left. Or at least that was how the Baroness described it to her husband. So it's like there's like funny moments of where things are documented. There's documentation, in this letter. But still, the narrator says, "Well, maybe this is what happened, and maybe not."
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that part, the line, yeah, and unless we come to Arcamboldi's sister, Lata Rider, this section goes from 864 to 891. That's got to be like the longest uninterrupted stretch
Unbroken.
in this book. A big chunk.
I just thought of another. We've come up with thesis ideas. This next line on 835, right after that, where she spent 15 days lying in the sun, going for long swims that Ingeborg and Arcamboldi couldn't take, or that they postponed for another reincarnation.
Yeah.
I would love to go back through the book again. All of those dreams about water and the goddess under the water, and him being the seaweed, and just go through with water imagery throughout each of the section. This idea of the reincarnation, and because everybody has these dreams of things coming out of the water, and his wife drowned, or I keep calling him his partner drowned. So that'd be really to go back through and see what that imagery is through that lens.
Yeah. And it's interesting the word it's interesting that he introduces the idea directly of reincarnation.
That's really strange to have that there. I don't. That doesn't make it. Yeah.
Because like I think the book like hints at reincarnation in the sense of like with events, like the the cyclical nature of things, and so why wouldn't souls be cyclical as well? Like so there's, and I don't know, it's kind of, that's interesting, Brian.
There's one more to tie together on motifs and themes from other weeks, and 868, when Rada's mother replaced the civil servant with a mechanic, a jovial man with his own business, who's doing very well repairing vehicles for the occupation troops and truck for the farmers and factory workers of Paderborn. As he said himself, he could have found a younger, prettier woman, but he preferred someone decent and hardworking who wouldn't suck his blood like a vampire.
Yeah.
Yeah, the vampire again. Yep.
It's in my blood. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty good book.
Yeah. I'd say it's astonishing.
It's funny, like, because it mentions this in Echeveria's postscript about it being finished or not finished kind of idea. And I mean, for a long time, the people have always said, well, it's not finished, but I don't understand that. Like, it's maybe not polished is what he's saying too, but I don't feel like it's unfinished.
Like that it was going to say, soon afterward, he left the park and the next morning he was on his way to Mexico, and then a couple of spaces. And then once he got to Mexico, Arcamboldi was staying at an oasis. And, you don't think, so you don't have the sense that more was going to be written to the end of the book.
I don't. Yeah. I feel like even if there was, so Rodrigo,
is there another part? Basically,
Rizan said that there was going to be a 6th part, and he says it in this interview book in which it is 2666, and Arturo Bolano is broadcasting all these stories down to the inhabitants of Earth from like a satellite, which would be like a frame tale, which I think I could see talking about, but not in relation to this book, but as part of the mythos of the Bolano universe. Like maybe there was another book that Bolano would have written that would have been the science fiction book that ties together a bunch of the different books, but I don't think it's necessary for this. And I don't think that this ends in a way that's completely satisfying. It's circular. It's got that sort of, like, I tried looking too, and I couldn't find a comprehensive timeline very quickly of the events of 2666, but there's like, it interlaces in so many interesting ways, and it feels like a whole package to me. Like that last line is perfect.
It's beautiful. And also ending with the Fürst Pückler thing.
Yeah. Like,
describing this person and then saying ending on the word legacy practically, in like the last 3 lines.
Like that beat.
I think this is so beautiful. I think we should read a little bit from this paragraph about Fürst Pückler. May I?
Yeah,
please.
Of course.
Okay. Okay. And so he wrote and published, and in his own way, humbly but in fine German prose, he raised his voice against injustice. I think he had little interest in knowing where the soul goes when the body dies. Interesting here, following on reincarnation, like talking about the soul now. Although he wrote about that too. He was interested in dignity and he was interested in plants. About happiness, he said not a word. I suppose because he considered it something strictly private and perhaps, how shall I say, treacherous or elusive. He had a great sense of humor, although some passages of his books contradict me there. And since he wasn't a saint or even a brave man, he probably did think about posterity. The bust, the equestrian statue, the folios preserved forever in a library. What he never imagined was that he would be remembered for lending his name to a combination of 3 flavors of ice cream. That I can assure you.
But then the best part. So what do you think? I don't know what to think, said Arcamboldi.
I know. Yeah.
After the soliloquy.
What do you think?
I've got to think about this. But whatever it is, possibly sends him to Mexico. But that's really interesting. The bust, the equestrian statue.
Yes.
This is the folios preserved. I mean, this is what Bolaño was facing at this time. He had reached like a pinnacle of fame and success as a writer, and was writing literally against death. He was writing at this time against his own death. And so it's kind of interesting to imagine this ending also within that context,
Even if, I can't remember where it was, but I've mentioned this a few times. I believe the story is that he wrote this part first, but I could see like in the revision process, this ending coming up later.
I don't know. I have not read that. I believe you, but I don't know.
I love this part too, taken into context of marginal writers and minor works, right? Where was that at? Anyway, as perceptive as they could be, little books that made it seem as if the ultimate purpose of each of his trips was to examine particular gardens sometimes forgotten, forsaken, abandoned to their fate, and whose beauty my distinguished forebear knew how to find amid the weeds and neglect.
Yeah. His little books, despite their, how shall I say, botanical trappings, are full of clever observations, and from them one gets a rather decent idea of the Europe of his day. Yeah.
This is random off of that, but I was flipping back through the pages that I dog-eared, and there's a great line about when Lata reads the book on the plane by accident and is like, holy shit, like this person, I know this person. As she waited in LA for a connection to Tucson, she looked for more books by Archambault in the airport bookstores, but there were only books about aliens, people who had been abducted, encounters of the third kind, and sightings of flying saucers. There's the great related to the publishing thread, the Boobas part where he's like, wants to go restart his company. And he's like, even though all anyone wants to read are books about stamps and detective novels.
Right.
If only he was around to know about all the titles that just have girl something and about murder.
The girl.
Girl with the girl. Yeah. It's just gonna be a girl getting murdered.
Is this girl going to be in a window? Is she on a train? Is she in her car? Is she gone? Where's the girl?
Girl on the pontoon boat.
Girl on the flying saucer.
If only.
Yeah.
Oh man.
Yeah, this is devastatingly good.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this was my first time, doing TMR with you guys like throughout the season. How was the experience of reading this compared to other TMRs? Is it always like, I'm thinking like about how much I enjoyed reading this book again.
I truly believe that you are our number one fan, and that's why we invited you onto the podcast, because you were just the biggest fan and knew everything and listened to every episode and had
I should know
all these wonderful things to add to it. But like, alas, that was all a lie.
It was for Bolaño. But I mean, this was just so enjoyable. Like I could keep reading. I wish I could. This is like a world that I would keep perusing.
That's the same.
There's so much. There's like just so many threads and so many branches and so many little like the digressions. Like I just feel I feel like I'm reading a different book every time I pick it up, in that sense of like what's going to be brought up next.
Right.
What fact or strange story or anecdote.
I think that experience, I don't want to speak for you, Brian, but that experience has been the same for me throughout. Even if there were like there were books that weren't as good as this book, or as lending themselves as well as this book does to this format, there's still the process of like week by week, that kind of like seeing what's next, having the conversation and then using that to influence what I read in the next section. Like the things that are talked about show up there, almost like you would in a classroom, but like without that classroom trapping, obviously. Mm-hmm. I think that this season is unique in that having three people makes everything kind of triangulates it really well.
I think for me, the experience from previous seasons that would be the most similar to reading this book was probably Ada or Ardor.
Yeah.
Where it's like you could probably read the book 5-6 times and just pick a different thing to focus on, and that could be the season.
Yeah.
You could pick something different, where it's just really layered and deep, and you can really wrestle with it if you want.
I think the first time that when we did the first season, when we did the invented part, was one where like it was like that for me, having like just proofed and worked on it, but then reading the book in a different light, in a different context, really opened up, changed the way that you like related to it in a very positive way. Yeah. So
and like Ada, it was one where there's some parts where you like have to slog a little bit, but not too bad. Or it's a little confusing, but not too bad. But the end of it was just like, oh my God, like, yes, this makes it okay. Got it. Love it. Yeah.
I noticed my daughter took Lolita into her room to read.
Just now?
Yeah. I mean, not right now, but like this weekend, she was like looking through all the books and picked Lolita to read.
I think she's 16.
She's 18.
She's 18.
She's 18.
You must be old, Chad.
Nope, not. I'm 42.
It's probably because of all that the trial that's going on right now with the child pornography, sex island stuff, you know. So.
Sex Island. Whenever they make a movie of the Epstein and Maxwell stuff, it needs to be called Sex Island.
Sex Island?
Sex Island.
Oh my God. Horrible.
Oh, it really is. It's really horrible. So good that she got convicted.
Yeah, copies of Lolita are just flying off the shelf now.
What's that?
Copies of Lolita are just flying off the shelf now.
So yeah, so we'll be back at some point with another season. I don't know what it's going to be though, or when. So stay tuned. But in the meanwhile, do you guys have a favorite line?
Yes.
I just lost it.
Let me find it.
Oh, I found mine. Okay, so it's from when he's telling the story about whatever his name is, telling the story about killing his wife. And he's like, you know, some were suspicious. I saw the looks on their faces, but I didn't say anything, and they registered the death. Then I went back to the village and kept living, alone forever, he whispered after a long pause, as it should be.
Mm-hmm.
It's very Chad. Alone forever, as it should
I
be.
circled all part of it. Alone forever is circled in like 5. Yes, I understand you.
Oh my God.
I feel seen.
Where is this?
Mine's right before that on 828. If I had killed her, I'd be locked up by now, he said. All killers, even those who kill for a good reason, go to prison sooner or later. I don't think so, said Ingborg. There are many people who kill, especially men who kill their wives, who never end up in prison. Lube laughed. That only happens in novels, he said.
I mean, one thing we didn't talk about that is weird about that scene too is when Ingborg goes missing and then they find that house that everyone's murdered inside.
Oh yeah.
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 And like
I think they died of like carbon monoxide poisoning.
But that leads me to believe that she was probably killed.
Same. So someone mentioned that for anyone who wants more after finishing 2066, we'd recommend Woes of the True Policeman. Blonder started in the 80s, clearly where the story about 2666 gets fleshed out. I've also heard a reading of that book. I used it in my class a number of years ago now. But a reading of that book as being like Nabokov's, what is the name of it? The Harlequins book, where it's sort of like also, it's like Bolaño almost parodying Bolaño.
Okay.
Or like a doing Bolaño, and like all the frames are there, but it's also like that sort of fun possibility. But I don't know the real history on it. I just like that reading as like a way of it not being like a minor work that was a first attempt at 2666, but instead a book that was sort of like playing around with the things that he was good at, and sort of pointing them out in a way.
That's cool. Okay, my favorite line. Well, they're two little images that I want to leave us with. So on 835, this is when Ingborg and Arcamboldi are doing their wanderings around Italy, and she's so ill. The beginning of September found them in Rome, both dressed in shorts, dune or desert yellow colored, as if they were ghosts of the Africa Corps, lost in the catacombs of the early Christians. It's like it's like two old people, a sick old couple, wandering around in Europe in their khaki shorts, right? And then at the end, when when she dreams for the first time in a long time about her brother, she saw Arcamboldi walking in the desert, dressed in shorts and a little straw hat, It's just like it cracks me up, those two descriptions, to think of them as like, again, these just like really humanizing images of he's an 80 when at the end of the book he's an 80-year-old man, German tourist, heading
Still a
around,
German tourist.
you know, with like the little straw, like a little straw Panama hat.
Will you guys indulge me? Let me read the Dubliner section and the part that it reminded me of. Okay, so I found it. It's on page 841. And it says, like, he just found Arcamboli just found his family. And just as the Baroness was about to ask where he had found his family and under what circumstances and how, Arcamboli got out of bed and said, "Listen." And the Baroness tried to listen, but she couldn't hear anything. Just silence, utter silence. And then Arcamboli said, "This is what it's about, the silence. Do you hear it?" And the Baroness was about to say that one couldn't hear silence, only sound, but the comment struck her as pedantic, and she didn't say anything. And Arcamboli, naked, went over to the window and opened it and leaned half his body outside as if he planned to throw himself into the canal, but that wasn't his intention. And when he pulled his torso back in, he told the Baroness to come and look. And the Baroness got up, naked too, and came over the window and watched as the snow fell on Venice.
Mm.
And the ending of The Dead is different than that, but it just reminds me of that covering of things and the sound of it. The ending of The Dead is a few light taps on the pane made him turn to the window. It had begun to snow again. He watched sleepily the flakes, silver and dark, falling obliquely against the lamplight. The time had come for him to set out on his journey westward. Yes, the papers were right. Snow was general all over Ireland. It was falling on every part of the dark central plain, on the treeless hills, falling softly upon the bog of Allen, and farther westward, softly falling into the dark, mutinous Shannon waves. It was falling too upon every part of the lonely churchyard on the hill where Michael Fury lay buried. It lay thickly drifted on the crooked crosses and headstones, on the spears of the little gate, on the barren thorns. His soul swooned slowly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe and faintly falling, like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead.
Mm. It's beautiful.
That Joyce had a knack for words.
Yeah.
That old Joyce.
Seems really appropriate that we end 2666 by reading a white author. Thanks, Chad.
White European. The Irish were long oppressed.
That's true.
I have to say.
Oh, God. Okay. Stop there. Anyone have any last thoughts? Nope.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. This was fun.